Evening everybody, here we have the post build video of the Meccano Maker System Thunderbird 2. RRP $79.99, but even just a week or so into these sets being available, I've already spotted it on the internet for £10 less at $69.99. Of course, postage and packaging might wipe that out, and I can't tell you where I saw it because I just can't find it now, unfortunately, so sorry about that. In the last video about the set itself, I mentioned several sets and prices. Well, I've forgot a few sets, so forget what I said about the set prices there. I will be putting together an RRP list and set pictures of all the currently available sets, or in some cases some of the sets are not quite out yet, but hopefully will be very shortly. That'll be on the forum when it's back up and running. It's still down after 15 days. The server's gone pop apparently. Now, with this set, overall it's a fun set, a very good set. Parts wise, it's very good. It does look a little bit expensive on the face of it, but it just depends what parts you're after. If you need, you know, an odd spare part these days, it generally means buying a set unless you go to the dealers, the private dealers. But we have 13 narrow angle brackets, 4 hinges, 5 1 3/4 inch, that's about 44.5mm bolts, and unusually for a modern set, a decent amount of washers, there's 31. So regarding the actual value for money in the set, which in the main is still available only at the RRP price, apart from that one place on the web so far, what do you get for your $79.99? Well, you get quite a few parts, over 600 parts. The box size perhaps makes it look a little, oh, it's a lot of money for what it is. But is it? We've got 141 standard bolts and 179 nuts. Adding the 4 hinges, which last time I looked were about 150 each. All those parts, or rather just those parts together, at 26 quid thereabouts at a dealer. So that's a good chunk of the set parts in price terms, and probably in actual amount of parts really, there being so many nuts and bolts of course in most sets. But we haven't even looked at any of the flexible plates for a start, none of the spacers, none of the encapsulated nuts, the cylinder for the mole, the pulleys for the mole. So I think really it's not a bad value set. On the face of it, it doesn't look it, I agree. It would be nice if it was 50 quid. But of course, everything would be, wouldn't it? Everything it would be nicer if it was cheaper. But I suppose the old adage, don't judge a book on its cover, you know, really. But a fun build, not a quick build, but I'll come on to that in a bit. We'll do it in stages if you like. Now, the first thing you build is the mole, which you can see here. Quite a basic model and quite an effective looking model, and perhaps a decent scale size. Well, scale's probably a too strong a word there, but a decent size compared to the Thunderbird itself, a good match. That took about 20 minutes to build, and it doesn't really show you in the exploding diagram for the drill part of the mole, which is this. It's got all this exploded with the bolt and also the rubber tyre, the small rubber tyre. But it doesn't really show you when to put the rubber tyre on. If you put the rubber tyre on and then the nut, you won't get at the nut with the spanner. So put all that together first. It may seem a no-brainer, but it doesn't really show you in the instructions. Put all that together first like that. Then put the rubber tyre on the end of that and push it into as one into the cylinder. Now, as you can see there, once the cylinder's in, it tends to stay in. Quite nicely done. Now, as I said, that mole was 20 minutes. The pod was a fair bit longer. That was almost 1.5 hours. I've got it written down here as 1 hour 27 minutes. There is a... It's not an issue. It must be an art niggle. When you come to build the pod, or rather towards the end of it really, well certainly halfway through, If you note now, on this side here there's one bolt in the centre there, and the same there. That's not what it shows you in the instructions. It's got, I forget which side now, but it's got 2 bolts there like that, or maybe there on one side, and 1 bolt in the middle. There's no need to have the odd 2 bolts. One each side does the job very well indeed. So I'll remove that odd bolt, don't need it at all. Regarding the actual curving of the plates for the pod and the main vehicle, it's not as hard as you might think. Oh, that's going to be a bit of a pain to do. Not at all. If you've got fairly large hands, the first one you do is the front, and you curve over, sort of like pull it together like that. If your hand's big enough, then you can get the bolts in and it's okay. Forming this end half forms the rear end, and so that makes the rear end easier. If you're a kid and got small hands, get somebody to fold it over for you and hold it in while you fit the bolts, or vice versa. It could be that you need another pair of hands one of those times, but it's not difficult. They do, all the curves form very well, quite easily, but I would say if the next person who made this model, there would be slight differences in the build. I've tried to make sure everything on all the model is quite nicely done, kept a good look and a good eye on the line of things, making sure everything's aligned correctly. But I dare say, as in any Meccano model where there's curves involved, there'll be a slight variation if somebody built another model of this set. One thing that happened to me while I was building the pod, and as far as I can recall has never happened to me at all in all of my Meccano builds, recently over the last few years or so, maybe 3, and before that when I was a kid up until I was about 13, 14, and that is the spanner actually bent while I was building part of the pod. What happened was one side of the jaws of the open end of the spanner opened up a little bit, odd. What I did do though, I did persevere with it, which probably slowed the build of the pod down, I should think. It was hard to get into the corners a little bit with it, hard to grip the nuts, it being really now too big a spanner. So I stopped using that spanner in the end, although I did persevere with it for some time, but I've just dug another spanner out. You will collect many spanners and many Allen keys. If you have a few sets, you will get at least one of each in each set. The zinc parts in the set, as you can see, there's quite a few zinc parts here and there. Perhaps it would have been better green, but the zinc, being in good contrast to the green, does outline the model a bit. And I suppose it's cheaper than sourcing, although I suppose they have already sourced the paint for the green parts. But zinc is the common finish for those parts like strips, curved step strips, brackets, fish plates, and of course nuts and bolts. The zinc itself is pretty good. I have seen better, but I've seen a lot worse. There's 1 or 2 parts it's a bit dull, but it's a decent covering. The one thing that is a little bit thin is some of the Meccano stampings, the actual name stampings on the parts. Some parts, or rather zinc parts, don't have them, and some of them are a bit thin. I'd like to see that a bit more crisp, as they are on some of these fish plates here, these narrow fish plates. It's very crisp on there. You've got to show the name off in my book. You've really got to show it up. Just get the name out there. So that'd be nicer if it was on more parts and a crisper stamping. There is an error in the artwork for the pod. In the instructions, it's fairly obvious mine, but I will point it out. In the inset parts list for about 3 stages where you are using these curved step strips here, I can't recall whether that's the actual name for these ones, but they are stepped and they are curved, but they are slotted as well. These are the slightly larger version. There is a smaller version with a bit of a tighter radius to the curve. It shows that type in the inset parts list in about 2 or 3 stages, but there's none of them in the set. It's these. Fortunately, it does show these in the actual build instructions. Regarding the pod itself as a whole, it is very sturdy, but it does lack a proper floor, as you can see, and a rear. Now the rear isn't too bad because it does mean you can get access to push the mole out, but the floor means that the mole does fall out during play. Now of course, well, at least from our point of view, certainly when I was a kid, and let's be honest, even a bit now, because who doesn't want to play with a Thunderbird 2, you can, in flight as it were, the mole can fall out. So, simple fix. There are some spare bolts actually. You may be able to put a bolt or two at the back of this flange plate to stop it falling out a little bit. But of course, if you've got a spare in your parts, when you collect a few sets, a flexible plate or a couple of strips to make a bit more of a floor. But it really is quite a strong structure. The door is hinged. It does stick out a little bit, so if you've got a couple of spare washers, I suggest put one washer underneath the hinge at the bottom to bring it away from these sides here. That should help it to close. And of course the hinges are brand new, they're a little bit stiff, so be careful when you're folding it down, you don't want to bend that flexible plate. The main vehicle, there was a couple of niggles both sides with the alignment of some of the holes, about 2 or 3 holes each side. Wasn't a problem really because there is enough play in the system to get the bolts in. What happens is, I think, when you tighten up these bolts through here, you can't quite see there, but there's one there, there's strips at the back of here, and they tend to curve as you tighten, even though there are washers for spacers. I think that throws it out a little bit, but it's one of those things, once it's all together it comes good. The front end, I bet you're thinking, there's a few angles there that things are not going to line up really. It does line up very well and very easily. It just tends to form itself for the most part. There is a slight addition that I've done, and I think this may have been just missed out on the instructions. Here we have a curved corner piece. I forget what the name is for it, but it's like a corner section and it's flexible. It's this like memory flexible metal. That's made from it, and basically when you undo it, it should flick back to being flat. But in the instructions up here, it's not shown fixed anywhere, so it just hangs. And it's fine because it's still stiff even though it's flexible. It's quite fine to look at, perhaps a little bit untidy. What I found was the holes almost exactly at this end lined up with this corner here, both sides. So I undid these bolts there and the other side and threaded it through there. We've got a very decent structure. It was anyway, but it is even better now. Of course, there's stickers everywhere. There's no sticker for the door on the pod, but the stickers take about 15 minutes to put on. There are instructions to show you where the things go, but I suppose you could do what you want really. Some people probably don't use the stickers, but I do like to use stickers myself. A little bit fiddly here was these semicircular plates that slightly dished for the engine ducts. They're a little bit awkward to get in just because they are in quite close proximity, top and bottom, to other nuts and bolts. Can be done. Again, it may be one of those jobs where you need another pair of hands to hold it in place while you hold the spanner and tighten the bolt, but you can get them in. Another art error in the instructions, the wings, this is according to this stage 83 and 84, the inset parts list for the wings needed shows 2 in each stage. Well, of course there's only 2 wings there, 1 each side, so it's only 1 there. That's pretty easy to spot. I'm not keen on these plastic roses here. I'll just take a leg off and you'll see how easy it is, and this is why I'm not keen. Look how easy it is to get that off there. So I'll put the mole underneath because I don't want to break any more legs off yet. There we've got one of the roses there. I'll call them roses, I don't know what it is. I think a far better idea would have been the threaded rods, because you can put a rod, as you can see there's a bolt through it, you can put a rod straight through it, so you can still keep the same look with the built up legs with the spacers, large and small, and the washer. You could still have done that in the same fashion and it would have held together really well. It's probably my least favourite thing about the model because it does hinder the play value. The legs come off, or rather 2/3 of the legs come off very easily when you're playing with it. The exhausts are held on the same way. They come off perhaps they do stay on a little bit better, but they do come off easily as well. The legs, or the rear legs especially, because they are slightly inset more than the front. The front are quite wide, the rear are in a little bit. The pod will go in from the top and will drop out through the bottom, but getting out through the bottom with the legs folded is awkward. The legs get in the way a little bit, and you tend to knock the legs off anyway, or the bottom 2/3 of it, just because there isn't really much clearance. The pod fits quite well. The pod does stay in. You have to adjust these fish plates, these narrow fish plates. Now in the instructions it will show you that they're something like that, but that means the rear one doesn't fit, or fit against, the strip here. It fits against this flexible plate, which is a little lower, so it tends to tilt back a little. The front is not as flush, it's not dead flush anyway, but not as flush as the rear of the cockpit area here. And whether this is a trade-off of the latest version of Thunderbird 2 in the CGI series, it does sit a little bit on its back end anyway. It's a little bit higher at the front, so again it tips and doesn't help the mole to stay in, of course, falls out. But you can adjust it better by moving it forward like that. Adjust them to suit, because there will be a variation in the curve slightly, so you might have to adjust these. Of course there's some on the other side. Those are held on by the nylock nuts the usual way these days. Just adjust to suit, and to be honest, it makes it a bit awkward for me with this to mess with the pod, because I think I've got these just a little too tight. But you adjust those. Sometimes you have to adjust them out the way to drop it down, and adjust those to suit your build, to make it fit nice in the back. So the Meccano Maker System Thunderbird 2, with the pod loaded and the mole is in the pod, well, there's every chance he may fall out because it is leaning back slightly. The model itself is mostly based on the original 1965 version, but there are a few styling cues from the latest one, I think, although I haven't watched too much of the latest CGI series. A good set, really, quite fun. It's not really easy to do, and for me personally, I like that. If it's really easy, I'll sort of lose something. I do like, I wouldn't say a challenge, but something that makes you think a little bit without being really too awkward, and it's not. You might think the curves being one of those things, they aren't. They really come together very well. It's one point of the build where you think, here we go, this is going to be a bit much. It is not. It really builds together to form a good solid model, apart from the legs due to those plastic roses, and apart from, again, the plastic roses holding the exhausts on. Now, me preferring the original series, I will be putting some electrician's tape around the exhaust nozzles at the back to make it look even more like the original. It has folding legs. The rear ones don't fit quite flush, but those legs are the things that hamper the play value, I think. I will, yeah, thinking about it, I will probably be tweaking it with threaded rods for the legs, and maybe, if at all possible, some rollers for the pod. I'll also try and source some numbers, and if I can gather together some parts that are a similar green, perhaps the army multi-kit, the combat multi-kit, maybe, well, that'd be near enough. And I have quite a few of those in spare parts. Make other pods, create other pieces of equipment for in the pods. Doing a Thunderbird 4 in Meccano is going to be tough, that size. But it's all inspiration. So a good build, it took me 4 hours 38 minutes. I would say 3 to 3.5 at best. Take your time and those curves will come together very well indeed.